Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is an Albion Knight, and before I get into the video, some context about what you're going to see. One, I have two examples of the Albion Knight. One is my own property. I've owned it for a long time. I bought it secondhand. It's an Albion Knight that was likely manufactured over 20 years ago and is just not entirely representative of a brand new sword if you were to get one today because of all the pings and dings and scuffs and scratches from use that it has endured over its long lifespan. The second sword is on loan to me from a local sword friend who graciously lent it to me so I could do some comparisons for you. Hopefully it is helpful to see some of the differences in how Albion has changed over the years. They're subtle, but they'll be interesting to you sword nerds out there. It also is not a safe queen. It also is not necessarily representative of what a brand new sword would be. As you see me use it, you should know that I don't study HEMA. It will be obvious when you see me move it around. If I look silly, I feel that way too. Heads up for you, not claiming to be an expert. The last bits you should know are some bits about the cost. So the sword itself is around $1,000. The Scabbard, which you'll see featured here, manufactured by Andy Sunda, and I'll link his information in the description down below, is around $600 if you were to buy one of the Scabbards new. So totaling, that's $1,600 ballpark to get this sword in the package and configuration that you're seeing it here. It could be more if you want a more detailed Scabbard from Andy, more elaborate fittings. It can cost more money. Likewise, if you want the Albion antiqued or blued or something bougier, then it's going to cost another couple $100s to do that. So this configuration would be ballpark around $1,600. Also, last thing, promise, I understand there's a bit of a wait if you want to buy an Albion brand new. So if you really like what you're seeing here, do bear in mind that there's probably a bit of a wait ahead of you. So all that considered though, on with the reviewing. All right, sword friends, I go soup to nuts, top to bottom. I'm going to start with the pommel, beginning with the peen block. And the peen block is this little hat on the top of the pommel. My understanding is it serves as a way to basically give you runway to work with the handle. If you need to take it apart, you can sand this, the peen block comes off, you can disassemble the handle, clean it, change the furniture, and you still have a little bit of peen to work with without having to elongate the tang or do some sort of surgery on the sword. It may serve other purposes than that. You see them on historic swords. I don't know that they're necessary now, but it certainly has a look which is appreciable. This one is well done. It's even and relatively symmetrical, at least it is to my eye. On the older version, it's a little off-kilter, and I think it came that way from Albion, though the amount of life the sword's spent out of my hands, I can't really say for sure. It just gives me the impression that it probably came that way from the factory. In either case, the peen is nice. The facets on it are not too sharp, nothing bites in your hand, and you can't really get like a fingernail under where the peen is done, which is also pretty common on a lot of swords. They're usually like mushroomed over in a way that you can kind of feel. Here you have to really stare at it to even see which part is the peen and which part is the peen block. It's really well finished and quite handsome. As I move down to the pommel itself though, this looks like any other wheel pommel you might see, but if you know Albions, you know there's usually a little bit more depth to it, and this one is no exception. It tapers in, so where it meets the peen block is a little thinner, where it meets the grip is a little fatter, at least in this dimension. And the facets, the faces of these this wheel pommel here is also kind of canted in at a slightly off angle. Now, I can't say that that makes it any more comfortable for me. As I mentioned, I'm not a big fan of the Knight. Part of it is the wheel pommel. I just don't jive with them. It doesn't hurt my hand a lot, but it doesn't feel comfortable when I swing it around without a glove. And it's not because there's sharp facets or anything like that. This is a well-done wheel pommel. It just doesn't feel great in my hand. The fat of my hand just wants to interact with this wheel pommel in an uncomfortable way, and I can't seem to escape it. So while it is a well-done wheel pommel, it is still one that kind of rubs on me the wrong way. Still faceted, has dimension, and I love that it looks simple but has depth when you look at it. Things that you can appreciate, little nuances that you might see in historic pieces are kind of brought over here and really well executed, which again is something you probably come to expect when you hear the word or name Albion. All right, sword friends, I'm going to talk about the grip now, and I'm going to talk first about the execution on the grip, and I can say that it is really, really great. Between both examples, they're great. They're consistent in terms of shape, they're consistent in terms of where they're placing the materials in terms of size, they're consistent in terms of not being able to feel the seam and also holding up quite well. Now, my example is really quite old. It's gone through lots of changes in temperature and humidity, and it's still rock solid. I don't feel any loosening in the leather. I can't get a fingernail underneath the ledge here that you would see in the seam of the leather. Now, the seam of the leather in this one is more pronounced. They tend to be that way depending on the dye that you choose. This one is a little bit more blotchy. I'm not sure why that's the case, but depending on the color you choose from Albion, the seam of the leather can be more accentuated or not. In this case, it's very, very prominent. In any case, I can't get a fingernail anywhere. And as you're holding the sword with a glove or not, if there's a seam, sometimes they just catch on things and start to loosen and peel away. That's not the case here, and it's not the case on the older example. The other bit is it's just good looking. There's no residue between the pommel or the crossguard where they meet the grip. Sometimes there's marks for cutting off excess bits of leather or extra dye left over or some other schmutz or debris that gets caught in there from buffing compound. And none of that is here. It's really, really clean and well done. And it's clean on the older example as well. Now, in terms of the shape, they're pretty consistent shape. It's more cylindrical at the base, more elliptical at the where it meets the cross. That means that if I hold it in my hand, I can really kind of feel where the edge is. It indexes quite well. It also locks into my hand pretty well. So I like to hold the sword in a hammer grip reasonably tight and try to push on the quillins and see if I can twist the sword. Now, sometimes I can just move the sword really freely in my hand regardless of how hard I'm holding it. This one, I don't require really much of a grip to have it really lock in and not move around in my hand. So it gives me the impression that if I start swinging at stuff hard, it's not going to be twisting. I'm not going to have to fiddle with my grip very much. And it does that in a bare hand. So well-made grip. It also has this swell in the center, which I really feel like fills up the meat of my hand here. Really gives me the impression I'm connected to the weapon. It's an excellently done grip. It looks really simple, but again, it's more cylindrical, more elliptical, swelled in the middle. There's nuances that you don't necessarily appreciate until you start looking really, really close at it. And both of these examples have it over a long span of manufacture. Moving up to the crossguard, shouldn't surprise you, there's some more depth here than meets the eye. We have an octagonal crossguard that is kind of flared out at the ends. It tapers down a little bit in the center and then smooths out and raises to not quite a center ridge where it meets the blade. The gap in the crossguard is also really small on both examples. This is the thing Albion seems to do well consistently across just about every offering they have. A bad example of an Albion would be like having a full millimeter on any spot. This one looks to be relatively tight. Not the tightest Albion I've seen. Sometimes it doesn't seem like I can get the edge of a razor blade between them. This one, I can make out that there is a gap, but it is very small and well manufactured. When you're spending this kind of money on something that's a detail that I really appreciate, I have to look at it quite a lot, and it's something that was done sometimes historically, though there's lots of examples of historical swords with prominent gaps. So if you get one like that, it's not the end of the world. It doesn't impact the sword functionally, but I like to see tight tolerances here. This is well done, and doubly hard for Albion. They don't leave like a lot of extra meat down here where the blade meets the crossguard, so to have these kind of tight tolerances is really a show of skill or craftsmanship or planning or the combination of the three. All right, so friends, now I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy, stabby part. What we have is a Type 12 blade, and this one has a fuller that runs approximately 2/3 up the length of the blade. Covering first the fullered section here, there's not much in the way of profile or distal taper. It's pretty straight, relatively mild taper, and also in the distal, or in this direction right here, it doesn't thin out a whole lot. It does, and I've taken measurements and put them in the description down below if you're interested. After the fullered section here, it tapers much more aggressively and in both dimensions and thins out quite a bit. Now the blade has some flex to it, not a lot. It actually feels reasonably rigid. The older version is a little bit more flexible. It weighs a little bit less, feels a little different in the hand, but I'll talk about that in greater detail a little later. The fullers kind of gradually peter off. They're relatively even in how they transition, but they just kind of peter off. I would love it if Albion made these fuller transitions just a little crisper, a little bit more intentional. It's one thing that I don't really like the way Albion does. Not that it's ahistoric or bad, but it just kind of lacks the crispness that I expect in just about every other aspect of how Albion does things. The blade has slight surface ripples, ever so minor, just, minor bits from tooling or sanding or however they're finishing the process, but you don't notice them unless you're really, really looking for them. Overall, it's very clean and well manufactured. It also feels really good in the hand. I'll talk about dynamics more, but before I do, I'm going to talk about the edge, and this is what I would call Albion sharp. Both examples are about the same level of sharpness. Albion doesn't usually give you a razor edge. They give you a decent enough edge, but it's usually not particularly fun to cut with unless you hone it up. So if you get an Albion and you want to cut bottles and pool noodles and things like that in the backyard, you will probably want to expect to sharpen it a little bit out of the box. Not that they can't do it with good technique. They have edges and geometry that are well suited to cutting. At the same time, it's certainly aided if you put a razor edge on it, and they hold up actually reasonably well with that edge as well, but you have to do that yourself or pay somebody else to do it. Now, I haven't done it in either case, which means the cutting that you might see is not going to be great. If I put a razor edge on it, it would likely do much better. In any case, it has an edge on it, but prepare yourself to have some added cost if you want to do like fun backyard style cutting, because with the edge that comes on it, it's not particularly fun to do cutting. It's the bottles and pool noodles just kind of laugh at you. Moving from there, though, I'm going to talk about the differences between the two swords before I talk about the example before I talk about dynamics, because they go in slightly different directions, and it's kind of surprising here. So usually Albions have really consistent tolerances between blades. Now, these are manufactured at very different points in history. Well, not very different points in history, but about probably 10 to 20 years apart, potentially. And between them, one is like 2 pounds 7 ounces, one is 2 pounds 11 ounces. And the Albion Alexandria, for example, that I had some time ago had only 2 ounces in difference over a much larger blade. This arming sword has, 3 to 4 ounces of difference, and most of it seems to be in the blade. The hilt furniture looks roughly the same. The hilt's the same size. The peen block's the same size. I would venture a guess that, they're both wood cord pieces, so I don't think the weight is in the hilt furniture. The blade has ever so slightly different proportions. The newer one has more, shoulders visibly that go about a quarter inch up the blade, where it just kind of starts to taper in a little bit. A little thing that I see a lot on historic swords and love to see on the newer one. The older version has a slightly crisper and what appears to be deeper fuller. I don't have calipers that can really measure the depth of the fuller, but it appears to be a little deeper. That likely cut off some weight, and the newer version is more robust or thicker at just about every dimension that I took, as opposed to thinner like the older one. What that means is that this newer one, it feels stouter. It has a higher point of balance. It doesn't feel clumsy or bad in the hand, but it certainly feels more authoritative. It feels like it's going to be a better chopper. The older version is a little bit more nimble in the hand. It feels like I have better point control. It doesn't feel like it'd be bad in the cut, but it feels like it would deliver quick cuts better than really effective cuts. This one feels like a good big chopper, and it's surprising that I get different feelings between the two swords depending on what amounts to only a couple ounces of difference in the blade likely itself. So this is the widest variety that I've seen between two examples of an Albion sword. I've had the Albion Mercenary in the past, and that had different hilt furniture, but felt really, really pretty much the same. And then I've had the Alexandria, and I've had 2 of those at the same time, and there were like 2 ounces of difference between them, and they more or less felt the same. These feel like, if I held them differently, I would kind of suspect that they were different model swords. And so even though they're the same shape and size and look the same, they do feel different in the hand, which is surprising. And it's noticeable even to non-sword, nerdy folks like me. The gentleman that lent me the newer version is certainly an interested sword person because he's spending a lot of money on swords. When he picks up the 2 examples, really noticeably, the older version that I have is lighter and more maneuverable in the hand. And I think that's what a lot of people really like about the Albion Knight. So I would venture a guess that the older version is probably the preferred one. Though I think, depending on the person, this is not a clumsy sword and it feels a little bit more authoritative in the chop. Mine feels a little, the older one, the one that I actually own, feels a little bit more nimble in the hand. Anyway, those are the subtle differences that I could notice. They're very small, but they amount to some pretty big changes in the sword, which is, if nothing else, interesting to me. Now I'm going to talk about the Scabbard from Andy. Now, I've noted that the blades have subtle differences between them, but because of the same shape and size fundamentally, they both fit comfortably in the Scabbard. They both retain really well. They're both pretty solid. So it gives me the impression that while there are nuances and differences between the swords, fundamentally they're kind of the same shape. They're being made to a template likely at Albion, and they're going to fit kind of a standard Scabbard. So if you have a Scabbard made for your Albion, it's probably going to fit whichever Albion Knight you happen to buy. Anyway, if I talk about the Scabbard itself, I'm going to start at the mouth of the Scabbard right here. So one thing I would love to see Andy do is I can see that the flaps are kind of folded in and it's left some unfinished leather in here, as well as a visible area where I can make out the wood core of the Scabbard, as well as the felt that he's lined it with. So it's a felt lined Scabbard for $600. I think Andy does generally really great work for what he's charging. But it would be nice to see like another slip of leather put in here, or this side of the leather finished, and to have this wood part covered. It's just seeing behind the curtain a little bit, seeing a little bit more about how the sausage is made, and I find this to be an unflattering look in the Scabbard. So this is not my favorite part. At the same time, I can very easily sheathe the sword. It's not a problem there. It's just if I fold these flaps back, it looks a little bit unsightly. On the back of it, I'm going to talk about that first. There's a seam that runs down. I don't make out stitching, though it may be present here, but there's a seam that runs down the back. And there's also some wavering in the dye that's been used, or whatever stain has been applied to it. I happen to like it's not blotchy exactly, but it has changes in kind of the intensity of the color. And I happen to like that when I see it on European Scabbards. gives me like a, I don't know, a rough and tumble handmade kind of look that blends in well. And the handle itself from Albion also has some kind of changes and alterations in the color as you look over it. So I think it matches well with the scabbard. Now, the front side is really where the business is, and there's all manner of details that Andy has provided on here. So we've got some cross patterns here, and then there's some diamond patterns with additional little detailing on them that makes it look like a weave. It's an incredible amount of detail on a scabbard for $600. And if I look at what scabbards are out there for Albions, you can get something custom made from somebody like Andy. Todd Cutler, I believe, sells them, and they're not dissimilar in terms of price. What Todd Cutler does differently, I don't know if he puts the rain flappy things on here, so you might not have those. I think the chape at the end of Todd Cutler scabbards is a little better, but I believe Andy can buy better chapes, which incidentally I should talk about the chape. This is the other bit that I don't particularly like. So it looks like it just doesn't fit well. It's just a shoe size too big, and that has left these ledges in here. And the first time that I wore this, I always critique these things, these lips on here when they're wide because they get caught on something. And the first time I put this on, I grabbed a wire on one of my camera light stand things and tipped it over. They do hook on things, and it's kind of a pain in the butt. So I like when these do not have pronounced hooks because I'm clumsy, and if there is one here, I'm going to snag it on something and knock something over. It also has some tool marks and just general unfinished appearance, but I think if I pulled hard enough, it would just come off, and I could find a different one, or maybe cut this down or sand it or do something to it myself to finish it up in a nicer way. But I think this is probably the worst part of the scabbard is the chape, and I believe Andy could just buy nicer ones and put them on here. And it's more a matter of if you want to pay more money for it, then you can get nicer parts. This one I think could use a little bit of work though. It's really beneath the rest of the scabbard. The leather work he's done is absolutely fantastic. It has an incredible amount of detail and is absolutely lovely. The chape is just kind of clumsy and also, to me, a little bit of a hazard. But as it is, it fits the sword. The belt system that he's provided as well has some detailing in it, as well as what look like very nice kind of brass metal parts on it. The way this belt also rests, I happen to think it's a comfortable position. Apart from knocking some things over, generally speaking, it doesn't stick out too much. I like the suspension system and where it rests, but I don't wear these very often. So it's more like if I want to wear it to a Renfest or something like that. But fundamentally, I don't wear these. I don't practice with them so much. So how it stands and how it sits is, well, I think it's comfortable. It's comfortable for like me if I was going to wear it, but it's a nuance that I don't necessarily appreciate. Some people wear these a lot, wear the belt and scabbard and stuff quite a bit. To me, this is in a comfortable position, but that's from somebody who doesn't wear them very often. The last thing that I'll talk about scabbard-wise is just how much fun it's been to own this custom scabbard for the Albion Knight. So I had the Albion Knight in my collection, wasn't a big fan of it, and frankly, still not. But getting this custom scabbard really gave me a deeper appreciation for it as a whole package, and I certainly enjoy it more as an art object and something to look at. And I've heard other collectors say that the sword isn't complete without a scabbard, and that getting a custom scabbard is just really something that brings the whole thing to life. And I see that a little bit more now. I've had nicer swords that have come with custom scabbards, but this is the first time I've had like a scabbardless Albion for a number of years, gotten my impressions of it, and then later added a custom scabbard. And I would say it absolutely made me enjoy the sword more. And it's made me think about what other Albion swords I really like and want to keep in my collection, and what I might like to do to have them finished up with the scabbard, because it absolutely enhanced my enjoyment of the sword. So if you own an Albion sword and it doesn't have a scabbard, I would encourage you to look at somebody like Andy to have one made. And he can do some cool custom stuff. I'm going to maybe ask him about my Sovereign and putting swirly mitzidomes on it. Anyway, the point is, it really did make the whole package more fun. And I was surprised by that. To me, these are primarily fun objects. I bring them off the wall every now and again, go cut bottles in the backyard. And that's really what I do with European style swords. They hang on the wall and they look pretty. And then I also cut with them casually, but I don't use them to study any kind of formal system that I might need a scabbard for. And so it seemed to like an more or less storage or just an extra, but visually this is a beautiful thing. And it really has increased my love of the sword, even though I still don't like it. It's not the scabbard's fault. The scabbard absolutely elevated the total package though. And it's, like I said, it's made me think about adding scabbards to swords that I otherwise would not have considered adding scabbards to. All right, sword friends, I'm going to move on to cutting, and this is going to be really short. I didn't cut very much with it. I've cut with the Albion Knight in the past. It's always embarrassed me, and it's continuing to do so. Every now and again, I get a nice cut. It's kind of surprising when I do. Other times it just bats stuff around, and that is my experience cutting with the Albion Knight. I know this is short-lived. Watching people cut is maybe fun if they're skilled at it. I'm not, and this is not a sharp sword. I'm not going to sharpen it, and so I'm not going to achieve great results. But the cutting would absolutely have looked much better if the sword was much sharper and in more skilled hands, so take that for what it's worth. Anyway, sword friends, that is the useful information that I can give you. Hopefully at this point you know if one of these is worth it. Hopefully I've given you something to consider Scabbard-wise as well, but it's time I answer the question, do I personally think it's worth it or not? So, I'm not going to surprise many of you, but no, this one for $1,000 just isn't for me. It's a fantastic sword, and I can see how for some of you it's going to be the gem of your collection. It's a beautiful sword, it's well balanced, it's well thought out, it has nuance and depth, and so if this is something you like, it's very easy for me to say, yes, you will enjoy it. For me though, I just don't. It's just not my cup of tea. By contrast, there are other swords from Albion's collection that I really do enjoy. It's absolutely nothing to do with the manufacturer and just more with my preferences. The other bit is the scabbard. Now, for $600, I think you can get other scabbards elsewhere, but they're not exactly prolific on the market. Andy, I think, has done an exemplary job for what has been charged and what is provided here. The amount of detail on the scabbard is crazy. It has a crown and a lot of leather work all over the surface of the scabbard. It seems really well made. It's not overbuilt. It's not bulky and chunky. And the only complaint that I'd have would be the opening, which I'm at least not going to see very often, and is still perfectly functional and historically accurate and not a bad thing at all. And the other is the chape, which I could replace if I was less lazy. I might even be able to fix the chape that's on there and make it a little smaller with my, with a hammer or something. But those would be the only complaints. I think they're relatively small and they could be solved with more money. And if you asked Andy to do it differently. So if you want to spend a little bit more and really get something that is an order of magnitude better than some of the simple scabbards out there for basically the same amount of money, yes, I absolutely think it's worth it. I think he's done a great job, and I enjoy all the detail here. It really made me rethink buying scabbards for these swords and how much I would enjoy them, how much they would change what I appreciated about them in my collection. So yes, I do think Andy has done a great job. I think it's absolutely worth the money, and I encourage you to talk to him if you're interested in having a scabbard made. All right, sword friends, that's all I've got for you. Hopefully it's been an interesting video. Hopefully I've given you a few things to think about. Cheers, and thanks for watching.